Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hasselt conference. Thank you for spending a little bit of time on my poster. Um, my poster is about analyzing evolution of informal settlements through the lens of complexity theory. And this is a detailed case study in New Delhi, in India. Basically, the capital of the city is one of the largest metros in the world with about 25 million citizens, and their growth has doubled in just the last decade. So it's extremely intriguing for me personally to look at this urban fabric that changes because of such rapid urbanization of the city. With rapid urbanization, what's happening is that a lot of slum areas have developed. And originally, when we go back to history, things that looked like slums, maybe not as dirty, but the very basic architectural brick wall system of slums are what today we see as the city. So they evolved. And the slums today are also evolving. And the basic parameters here are, government policies and the economic status of the people who inhabit the slum. The agent in this case is the slum itself. The energy is the people who live in the slum that are coming from the outskirts of Delhi. Now, Delhi is a lesser known fact about Delhi is the NCR region, the National Capital Region, or the National Capital Territory that Delhi comprises of, which I'm going to talk about in the next slides. But the overall picture of this poster is trying to convey the message of evolution of urban villages to slums and then slums to cities, and how that is changing the fabric of the city itself. So I'm going to talk about that in a few slides, and I hope I can make justice to my research. Here is the map of the capital territory, or perhaps capital region, that I was talking about. This is particularly showing the percentage of slum population that was recorded in 2001. There is a 10-year, a century-long, basically statistical data that the government always looks at. And the last one they did, of course, was this time. And here it is extremely easy to see how the percentage of the slum population has increased in the middle of the city. And then there's a slight patch on the southern corner on the right-hand side. And that, just looking at this picture, made me wonder why that has happened. Here there are 60.1 and above, which is larger than the national average number of slums and slum population in percentage. And this is how the city shapes it. It has a very central business district model where most of the working class wants to be concentrated in the center. But because of government policies and those sliders, those parameters that we keep talking about in CAS theory, those parameters that govern this system altogether have created shifts in that population that has started moving towards the periphery of the city. Going to the next slide. Here, it's a very basic table that pretty much summarizes the different types of unauthorized or perhaps illegal or informal settlements in Delhi. It starts with unauthorized colonies, which are regularized, and then there are urban villages and rural villages based on their economic status and the way they are constructed. Then there are shanty tenement clusters, which in the local language are known as Juggi Jhopris. Then we can see notified slums and shanty tenements. It is extremely important to note that out here in the population, you can see the difference that the shanty tenement clusters and the notified slums have the largest percentage of people living in informal settlements. And why that is because, first of all, there's a lot of poverty and these people are really poor. At the same time, the architecture or the design of these places is very haphazardly and very quickly done. So it's ready to move in and ready to move out. There's a lot of migration that takes place in these places also. And of course, they are illegal for most of the time, so they're exempted from taxes, so on and so forth. It says shanty tenement clusters rarely exist. Now, I do want to make sure that we understand this table is representing the city of Delhi, and that is it. I'm not talking about all over India. So the way the city has developed, the shanty tenement clusters have actually evolved to quite a great extent, and they hardly exist anymore. They've turned into more of notified slums that are notified, okay, that this is a slum, and the government is now trying to produce solutions to tackle their problems and to integrate the people living over there. Yes, it does undergo meager improvements, but with such small improvements, with a very slow time rate, eventually it does evolve. We're moving to the next slide. This is a diagram that very much easily summarizes the building conditions, marked in blue, the planning interventions, marked in red, the infrastructure in green, and the tenure security in purple. It's from a range of 50 on the outermost circle to 0 on the very inner epicenter. The scale is of that range, and here we can see planned settlements, rural villages on opposite ends, notified slums and regularized and unauthorized colonies on opposite ends, tenement resettlements and urban villages on opposite ends, and unauthorized colonies and tenements in opposite ends. Why they are placed in this manner is because each opposite is actually relating in somewhat to one another in the way that they evolve. So perhaps rural villages eventually end up becoming planned settlements. And that's what the research is really trying to get to. Notified slums eventually turn out to be regularized but still unauthorized colonies, which will eventually become authorized when they have the infrastructure to be authorized. Similarly, urban villages give rise to tenements, and tenements give rise to unauthorized colonies. So it's a crisscross that's taking place in this particular diagram. And what comes out with the charting or the mapping of the percentage of improvements of building conditions, planning interventions, infrastructures, and tenure security in all of these gives rise to this very interesting diagram. And what I'm trying to trace is how this will actually shape up the city. So while looking at very closely at the way these things have evolved, one comes across 4 steps. And this is the easiest way to explain this to you in such limited time. Therefore, step 1 is there's an empty land that the farmers are the owners of that empty land, and they sell it to a government developer who wants to develop a city over there, a shopping district over there, so on and so forth. And they make use of the exemptions from municipal and building codes. Therefore, because of this kind of a rushed construction, haphazard urban construction begins, where codes and building codes and city planning codes are not really applied because of the lack of legalities and the supervision of people who are actually related to the field. Eventually, the village that was, just this agricultural piece of land, the village turns into a slum. And the villagers living in the village become slumlords. Going to step 2, what happens is the construction workers that came with the government start making space for new migrants, and commercial establishments start building up. Because when there's people, you need to have grocery stores, hospital, markets, so on and so forth. The migrants become permanent with time. And who are these migrants is a very important question to understand the energy in this complex system. The migrants are people coming from the national capital region. They're not the people of the city. They're people coming from the periphery of the city to settle in the city because of lack of jobs, because of the fact that their farm got destroyed because of drought or flood, and the very basic reasons for what migration actually happens. Eventually, that leads to interesting supply side response with schools coming up, vocational training happening in different centers, small businesses like grocery stores, boutiques, so on and so forth. Coming to step 3, we can see a change here that the surrounding area undergoes. So the surrounding pastoral land now tends to take the same characteristics of the original agricultural land. Students, salesmen, businessmen move in to that area because they see the benefits of that land and what they can build over it as infrastructure. And then stakeholders get involved to improve the space, and economic upgradation starts to happen. Because when they invest in the space, they create schools, colleges, hospitals, and this in turn makes the lives of the people living in the rural villages much better. Here, what's interesting is what was rural has converted into urban completely by the end of step 3. Coming to step 4, we can see how the village starts to gentrify, with the old villagers investing in real estate and owning up to the patterns that evolve by becoming more mixed. Hotels, restaurants, hospitals, so basically infrastructure that requires a higher range of money, time, trade, so on and so forth. Those things try to come up. And then they have new problems with overcrowding of people, and then problems like parking, sewage, disposal, waste management, so on and so forth. So here we see a developing city, and the seed has been, the seed that was laid in step 1 has finally started to germinate in step 4. The evolution process will be such that by step 5, 6, and 7, it will actually become a developed city in terms of a third world country that we always refer to, that is actually constantly developing. So with this ideal or this concept, I did a basic comparison on what the Western ideals of urban villages are and what are those ideals for the people in Delhi. So in the Western ideals, you can see that the villages will have about medium density, not too many people, not very few people. Whereas in urban villages in Delhi, there will be a very high density because people cannot actually afford the real estate that actually exists over there, because the residential housing prices are extremely high and they're skyrocketing every single day. They're just rising, leaving them with no more options. Mixed-use zoning happens to take place in both the cases, which makes total sense for this type of this typology of architecture. And in Western villages, because of the fact that the government has money and time to invest into the people, public transit is made available. Roads, railway tracks, bike lanes, pedestrians, all these things are laid out. Pedestrianization becomes very important in order to make the space better for people to live in. But that stage is reached quite later. Given the fact that Delhi is still developing, the government does not have enough to invest upon on these infrastructures, and therefore we have insufficient access to public transit, and there is very few moments that one can come across pedestrianization to make the space more beautiful and better. In the Western concept, urban design, pedestrians in public squares, and in urban villages in Delhi, you have forced pedestrians. So people who do not have any other way have their, guerrilla urbanism to find their own way and path, and then two more people take that path, four more people take that path. Eventually, it becomes a pedestrian, but it was not designated by the government. They do not have any public squares, perhaps not any green spaces or parks. And this technically just keeps creating havoc in the village because they do not have enough infrastructure to live a healthy lifestyle. The Western ideals support that villages are alternative to sprawl, so urban sprawl. But in Delhi, sprawl still prevails. And why I say that sprawl still prevails is because these villages are the villages that are technically changing the fitness landscape. They are always making different peaks and lows based on the number of people that inhabit the spaces. And all of this is eventually changing the borders of Delhi and the National Capital Region. They're changing how the people of the urban city deal with the rural people coming to the place, and how everybody socially, economically, and in terms of master planning, what's happening in the city. So in the Western ideals, there's high levels of self-containment for people because they think, oh, well, they have a house, they've achieved a lot, at least they have a roof over their head. But in this case, in Delhi, most of these people are migrants. They do not think that this is their permanent house. They feel this is temporary, it's transitory. They think this is meant to search for a job, and then eventually, once they have a job, they will hopefully be able to put themselves and their families in better conditions to live in. The concept in 1980s in Britain is what inspired the Western ideal, and the very important concept called Lal Dora in 1908, established by the British in India, of course, while they were ruling, has really established many guidelines about how urban villages are planned in Delhi. Just to enlighten you a little bit, Lal Dora is basically redlining spaces that need to be reconsidered for historic preservation, and just because the way they were very rich in their culture, their architecture, the spaces, the materials, everything about it had this very old feel to it that the country wants to preserve. Of course, it has seen a lot of history. Therefore, a lot of places in Delhi are still the same, they're preserved. They could have become monuments, but because we do not really have enough space, and the people still do have a right to that space, they live there. These are slums, these are informal settlements, but they're preserved historically. It does not happen to all the slums. Many of these preserved slums were actually relocated, resettled, so that they maintain their sanctity, and they do not come in the way of the usual urbanization that the city has, given the central business district model of it. Over here, we can see the different bifurcations that take place, starting with urbanization of villages that can be either authorized or unauthorized. And then when it's authorized, you're good to go. Eventually, you're just done with not being informal anymore. Therefore, when you're unauthorized, there's a chance to go to many different spaces. So when you're unauthorized, the settlement can either be non-regularized or regularized. Now, there is a difference between being authorized and regularized. What authorized means is that you're no longer informal. You have been considered as the citizen of the city, and you have followed all the building codes, the city planning codes, your infrastructure is perfect to sustain your population. Therefore, you become a part of the city. And sometimes it's also because of the fact that they're so historically, they've been there for so long that they really are authorized after so many years. With regularization, what happens is spaces are chosen based on the fact that their people have access to schools, hospitals, markets, fair price shops, so on and so forth. And will the people be able to sustain their infrastructure and perhaps even grow it better? So when a space is regularized, it is in the process of being authorized, but it is not authorized completely. When it is non-regularized, it's almost putting a tag on it saying that it is not fit in the landscape. It is not fit to be authorized, and therefore the people and the energy needs to drive it to a certain level and the people have to invest in it more so that it can be at par with regularized infrastructure. Now, what happens with regularized is some of them are notified slums that are undergoing rapid urbanization and improvements, and then some of them are resettled. So they're taken from the center of the city and they're put on the periphery of the city because the periphery has empty spaces for them to be located, and the inside of the city just wants to get rid of it because it's causing problems for pedestrians, for transportations, so on and so forth. Now, bifurcation 3.2 and 3.1, so we're talking about 3.1 here, that what happens with a non-regularized form of settlement is that it can either become a shanty tenement or it could also be a resettlement colony. But if this one is resettled, it will still be non-regularized. So that's something that's kind of common in both the bifurcations. And then in bifurcation 4, we see that the shanty tenements they can either form clusters, so they form networks and evolve in that direction, or they could eventually turn out to be urban housing. That is still non-regularized, but the infrastructure is very fit to have its population sustained for a very long period of time. In 4.2 and 5.2, what we see is that resettled regularized colonies or infrastructure can either be on the periphery of the city or on the inside of the city, that is the core or close to the core of the city. Now, the explanation of the poster comes to an end, and here we're looking at a map where clearly we can see resettlement sites of how these urban villages or slums were moved towards the periphery of the city. The star is in the middle, you can see. Imagine most of these were surrounding the star and how they have been moved towards the corners and towards the outside edge of the city. And this is how evolution will eventually change Delhi. And CAS theory can help us determine what's going to happen, how these particular settlements will eventually evolve. Is this the end? Are they going to evolve further? How will their resettlement make changes in those areas, in those cities? Will they become as big of a metro as Delhi or London or Caracas is? How can these things be affected? And CAS theory can really help with it because we can set our sliders and parameters. To change these parameters will make changes in the outcome of what we see on the map. And based on that, we can benefit with planning and construction. For now, this is it. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event, and thank you so much.